Welcome to the Exhausting Stories channel, where forgotten voices come alive in the quiet of the night. Tonight, let the weight of the day slip away. Find a comfortable place to rest, close your eyes, and let your mind drift through time. You won't just hear about history, you'll live it. In this story, we travel back to the crowded heart of ancient Rome, a city of 1 million people bursting with noise, ambition, and ingenuity. From underground sewers to towering aqueducts, fire brigades to fast food stalls, you'll experience the clever systems that kept the empire running. If you enjoy stories that carry you through time, remember to subscribe and let history whisper you to sleep. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is, and whether this story helped you unwind. The Exhausting Stories channel is here to bring you immersive historical journeys from the past, and we hope you enjoy them as much as we enjoy creating them. Imagine stepping onto a Roman street alive with energy, vendors shouting their wares, the smell of fresh bread wafting from a bakery, and neighbors gossiping in the crowded bathhouse corridors. Marble temples and grand villas rise next to noisy marketplaces and cramped insulae where families squeeze into tiny apartments. The city is a constant hum of carts, merchants and children darting between stalls. But beneath this vibrant chaos, Rome faced enormous challenges. How did a city of over 1 million people manage to feed its population, clear its own sewage, and battle fires, all without modern technology? You might picture aqueducts, but did you know Rome's water network once delivered more daily water than some modern cities? Today, you'll discover the ingenious ways Romans solved the problems of big city life, starting with one of the most basic needs of all. Imagine the chaos of a Roman grain market. You're surrounded by towering sacks of wheat, buyers jostling for position, and the sharp clink of coins changing hands. The aroma of fresh ground grain mixes with sweat and the salty breeze drifting in from the nearby warehouses. This scene played out every day in ancient Rome, a city where feeding over 1 million mouths wasn't just a daily task, it was a matter of survival. Without trucks, refrigeration, or supermarket aisles, Rome had to invent a food supply system on a scale the world had never seen. Supplying food to every corner of Rome stretched across the city's social classes, from wealthy patricians feasting in their villas to the poorest citizens waiting for their government ration. With little farmland near the city, Rome relied almost entirely on imports. Imagine what this meant. Millions of tons of grain, olives, and other essentials had to be gathered from provinces as far as Egypt and North Africa, shipped across unpredictable seas, and delivered to a city always on the edge of hunger. Even a brief stoppage risked hunger-driven riots against the emperor. The management of food wasn't just logistics, it was about power, order, and the fragile peace of the empire. At the heart of Rome's food security stood the annona, a state-managed system designed to guarantee grain distribution to the city's people. For many citizens, this program was the difference between life and starvation. Egyptian wheat contributed roughly 2/3 of the annona's annual grain imports, totaling hundreds of thousands of tons. Each year, tons of grain flowed into the city, with the government providing subsidized food for most and free distributions for the poorest. Grain became a symbol of social stability, and an emperor who failed to keep it moving risked losing his grip on power. Historians believe that disruptions in grain imports played a major role in outbreaks of civil unrest during times of transition between emperors. Poor citizens lining up at dawn for the grain dole often described their relief in court records and graffiti as a reminder that empire rested on bread. The lines could stretch for blocks, with people clutching their tokens and waiting for their share. The grain dole was not just a handout, it was a promise from the state that no Roman would be left to starve. For the government, keeping the grain flowing was as much about maintaining loyalty as it was about feeding people. With grain alone too bulky to distribute easily, Rome turned to bread, its daily lifeline. Instead of simply handing out sacks of raw wheat, the city embraced bread as a way to stretch resources and ensure everyone got fed. Bread wasn't just a convenience, it was the foundation of daily life for many Romans. Public bakeries churned out loaves by the thousands, sustaining both the needs of the poor and the appetites of citizens on the grain dole. Bakers played an essential role in this cycle, using subsidized grain from the annona to turn raw wheat into loaves affordable to even the most destitute. Their stone ovens burned day and night, with the rhythm of baking setting the pace for neighborhood life. These bakeries did more than just feed people, they became social centers. Neighbors exchanged news while waiting for their bread, and bakers became familiar faces in the community. The variety of bread on offer was surprising too. There were simple flatbreads, hearty sourdoughs, and even specialty loaves like panis militaris, designed to feed Roman soldiers on the march. This bread culture brought Romans together across class lines. Whether you were a senator or a laborer, you ate from the same staple. Behind the scenes, Rome's vast and intricately connected trade network kept the food system moving. Unlike earlier civilizations tied to local farms, Rome's reach extended across the Mediterranean. Egyptian wheat, grown along the fertile Nile, made up the bulk of imports. On some occasions, entire harvests from key regions were earmarked for Rome alone. North African olives, vital not just for eating but for lighting lamps, flowed steadily into the city's warehouses alongside wine and other staples. This network was a marvel of coordination, with every link in the chain critical to the city's survival. The operation started at ports and harbours like Ostia, the city's main gateway for goods. Picture ship after ship arriving from distant provinces, their hulls packed with cargo. Ostia's docks buzzed with activity as workers unloaded grain into enormous stone warehouses, called horia. These warehouses could store vast quantities of food, shielding it from rain, rodents and spoilage. The grain sat waiting for redistribution to bakeries, markets, and the thousands of citizens entitled to their monthly ration. With such storage, even a sudden disruption, like a storm or a failed harvest, wouldn't immediately plunge the city into hunger. Specialized ships, known as navis honoraria, made this logistical feat possible. These sturdy cargo vessels, often powered by a single massive sail, were engineered for long journeys across the Mediterranean. One navis honoraria could carry up to 400 tons of grain, enough to feed tens of thousands of Romans. To protect these vital shipments from pirates and storms, the empire maintained strong naval patrols along key routes. The reliability of these ships became the backbone of Roman logistics, and their safe arrival was often cause for public celebration in Rome. Yet the system was always under strain. Moments of crisis, poor harvests in Egypt, wars disrupting trade, or storms sinking ships could quickly lead to shortages. Political leaders walked a tightrope, knowing that any failure in the food supply could spark unrest. Emperors made grain distribution a public spectacle. Announcements of arriving shipments became citywide events, reassuring the people that Rome would not go hungry. The stakes were high. A hungry city could turn on its leaders in an instant. Corruption was a constant threat. Some officials took bribes to divert shipments or sold grain at inflated prices on the black market. Others hoarded supplies, creating artificial scarcity. These betrayals, combined with unpredictable weather and logistical mishaps, sometimes brought the system to the brink of collapse. Despite Rome's pride in its grain network, it was always vulnerable to human greed and the forces of nature. The importance of food extended beyond daily survival. Grain fueled not just homes, but also the empire's spectacles. Gladiators, the celebrities of Roman entertainment, relied on diets rich in cooked grains for strength and endurance. During games at the Colosseum, crowds often received free bread and olives, reminders that Rome's power rested on its ability to feed its people. The distribution of food at public events reinforced the connection between the emperor and his subjects, turning bread into a tool of politics as much as nutrition. Bakeries, too, played a role in shaping community routines. They were more than places to buy food. They were gathering spots where news spread, deals were made, and daily life unfolded. The familiar rhythm of the baker's oven, the sight of loaves cooling on wooden racks, and the smell of fresh bread became part of the city's heartbeat. In every neighborhood, bakers helped knit the fabric of Roman society. Despite all these efforts, the system's fragility was always apparent. A single bad harvest in Egypt or a blockade at sea could send shockwaves through the city. The government's ability to feed its people depended on military strength to protect trade routes and on honest officials to manage distribution. When either failed, the consequences were immediate and severe. Rome's food system was a marvel of planning and engineering, but it was also a story of constant tension. The city's survival depended not just on storage or agriculture, but on the empire's power to control distant provinces, secure sea lanes, and enforce order at home. Every loaf of bread was a reminder of the vast machinery required to keep the city alive. But even bread couldn't solve everything. Wealthier Romans demanded direct water in their homes. How did they get fresh water to every district? We'll cover that next. Imagine a hot Roman afternoon. The city is alive with noise, vendors bartering, children running barefoot through the streets, and the steady clatter of wagons on stone roads. At a public fountain, a small crowd gathers. People wait their turn to fill clay jars, gossiping in the meantime. Some pour a few sips of water over their faces to cool off before heading home. For citizens waiting at a grotto-like fountain, the sight of fresh water flowing after drought was nothing short of miraculous. But how did water surge out of the fountain, flowing constantly without slowing or ceasing? For a sprawling city housing over 1 million people, where disease could spread at the drop of a coin, ensuring clean, fresh water wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was survival. Providing drinkable water to a city the size of Rome might have seemed impossible, especially in a world without modern technology. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A steady supply of water was essential not only for drinking, but also for hygiene, cooking, and maintaining public baths, which were a central part of Roman culture. Without it, the tightly packed city streets, where people lived in close quarters and sanitation was always precarious, could quickly become a breeding ground for disease. Add to that the constant risk of unrest. A disgruntled population denied basic necessities was a recipe for chaos. Water needed to flow, but what was the solution? The answer was the Roman aqueduct system. Stretching for miles across varied terrain, these structures weren't just functional, they were groundbreaking. Imagine an aqueduct cutting across the countryside, a series of high arches reaching the horizon, designed not for show but to do one critical job: move water over vast distances. By maintaining a gentle downhill slope, water flowed continuously without pumps. Where geography made a smooth downward path impossible, engineers sometimes bored tunnels through hills using simple hand tools. Imagine carving miles of rock by hand. When valleys or uneven terrain blocked the way, the Romans layered arches to create elevated channels, each one meticulously measured to keep water moving while avoiding overflow or stagnation. The sheer variety of water sources tapped by these aqueducts was another marvel of their ingenuity. Freshwater springs, rivers miles away, and even melted snow from distant highlands were funneled into Rome's systems through these seemingly endless conduits. Many aqueducts ran underground to protect them from sabotage or environmental damage. But their most iconic sections were the grand, towering arcades, seen in places like modern France and Italy. Some sections rose as high as 100 feet, standing centuries later as reminders of the empire's engineering genius. Two of the most notable aqueducts were the Aqua Claudia and the Aqua Virgo, both masterpieces in their own right. The Aqua Claudia was completed in 52 AD under Emperor Claudius, and it was one of the largest and most ambitious aqueducts Rome ever built. beginning its journey from sources over 40 miles away. This colossal system delivered vast amounts of water directly into the capital, supplying everything from public baths to imperial palaces. Its high arches were so striking they became architectural icons, admired not only for their functionality, but also for their beauty. The Aqua Virgo, completed in 19 BC under Augustus, brought pristine spring water from a source considered especially pure. Its terminus eventually became the site of the Trevi Fountain, built centuries later. But in antiquity, the Aqua Virgo's clean water was invaluable for the everyday lives of Roman families, setting it apart and ensuring it played a special role in public health. Once water reached the city, it was distributed through a carefully planned network. Picture pipes crisscrossing underground, carrying water from central reservoirs out to every corner of Rome. Public fountains served as gathering points for citizens needing water for their homes, while the city's famous baths consumed massive amounts to maintain pools of varying temperatures. Wealthier Romans, however, didn't have to wait in line at the fountains. They could have water piped directly into their homes. This was considered a major status symbol and showed how access to resources subtly, or not so subtly, reflected the city's social hierarchy. Public baths were particularly remarkable in their use of water. Imagine stepping into a Roman bathhouse, steam rising from heated pools, the hum of conversation as friends caught up or debated politics. Baths weren't just places to get clean, they were social hubs and at times settings for business deal-making or cultural gatherings. On an average day, thousands of Romans might cycle through one of these bathhouses, and the water had to keep flowing. This demand drove the entire aqueduct system to operate at an astonishing capacity. Baths like the Baths of Caracalla or the Baths of Diocletian became symbols of Roman sophistication, but also massive drains on the water system. Water access wasn't distributed equally, however, and this disparity had significant social implications. Roman law actually controlled who could access what amounts of water, making it clear that some people, wealthier citizens and those with political influence, had priority. Private water rights could even be purchased, ensuring uninterrupted flow into the homes of elites, while others relied entirely on public facilities. The poorest citizens, those living in crowded tenement housing, often relied on overburdened fountains that could run dry if demand spiked. These fountains provided the bare minimum for their survival, but when water shortages hit, tensions could rise quickly. Beyond maintaining the city's hygiene and drinking water, Rome's aqueducts even shaped its economy. With so much water readily available, industries flourished. Tanneries, mills and fullers depended on consistent water supplies to function. Even urine was collected and repurposed in industrial processes like fulling, a fact that seems odd today, but illustrates how every drop was treated like gold in a city that couldn't afford waste. This created a cycle. Water drove industry, which propped up the economy, which in turn sustained the sprawling network of systems that made Rome thrive. One of the most fascinating aspects of this water system was the sheer amount it delivered. Historians estimate Rome's aqueducts delivered around 200 million gallons of water daily. That's enough for every citizen, rich or poor, to consume as much water as the average person does in modern cities today. For an ancient city with no electric pumps or modern infrastructure, this achievement stands as one of the most impressive feats in engineering history. But this vast system came with its challenges. Maintaining aqueducts required careful upkeep, particularly in preventing limescale buildup that could choke the flow of water over time. Workers regularly inspected and cleaned the channels to prevent natural obstructions or deliberate sabotage. And like any technology, the system was vulnerable to disruption. Earthquakes, invading forces, or simple human neglect could cut off entire water supplies. Still, the Romans seemed to anticipate these risks. They often built redundancies into their network. If one aqueduct failed, another could often take over its supply line, ensuring that the city didn't completely shut down. The aqueducts also served a symbolic role for the empire, functioning as visible markers of Rome's dominance over both nature and the regions it controlled. By building water systems that could sustain 1 million people, Rome sent a clear message. This was a city unmatched, a capital capable of engineering solutions on a scale no one else could imagine. When visiting dignitaries or travelers entered Rome, the sight of towering aqueducts may have inspired awe, reminding them of the power and discipline that made such feats possible. Still, the success of Rome's water system wasn't immune to occasional criticism in its own time. Some writers of the period, like the philosopher Seneca, questioned the empire's prioritization of luxury over necessity. He observed how water was lavishly diverted to ornamental fountains and private villas, while many citizens struggled to access clean water. These critiques reflect the underlying tensions in Roman society, a divide between extravagance and the fundamental needs of ordinary people. But whatever its flaws, the Roman aqueduct system remains an enduring example of problem-solving on a grand scale. It not only kept a city of unprecedented size functioning, but also defined a standard of public utility that was unheard of in the ancient world. When you think about its efficiency, delivering enough water to match what modern systems achieve, it's hard not to marvel at the ingenuity of engineers who worked without the machines and tools we rely on today. Yet even with water flowing from distant hillsides to every corner of Rome, another challenge loomed, one that affected every street and every home. The more water that entered the city, the more waste it generated. In a place where so many people lived side by side, the question of what happened to all that waste became just as crucial as the question of how to bring water in. Imagine walking along one of Rome's narrow, bustling streets. Vendors shout from cramped stalls, carts creak as they pass, and somewhere above you, shutters swing open to reveal a bucket being casually tipped over the edge. You leap to the side just in time to avoid a splash of dirty water, or worse. In a city of over 1 million people packed into tight quarters, waste was a constant presence. With no modern garbage collection or indoor plumbing for most households, managing human and household waste in ancient Rome was a daily challenge that affected everyone. Rome's population density and lack of running water in most homes meant that waste disposal was a pressing issue. There were no trash bins on every corner, and most residents didn't have sewer connections. As the city grew, so did the problem. Piles of garbage and contaminated water could quickly turn thriving neighborhoods into breeding grounds for disease. Overcrowded apartments and poor living conditions for lower classes only made the situation worse. Keeping waste under control was essential for the health and survival of the city, and the Romans responded with innovations that were remarkable for their time. Long before modern cities built underground sewer networks, Rome had already engineered the cloaca maxima, one of the earliest and most sophisticated sewage systems in the world. This monumental structure began as an open channel to divert floodwaters from low-lying areas into the Tiber River. By the 3rd century AD, the Romans had enclosed the cloaca maxima, transforming it into a closed tunnel that could handle much more than just stormwater. Public baths, communal latrines, and wealthier homes all connected to this vast network, which carried waste away from the city's heart. It wasn't a perfect solution. Disease still spread, and not every neighborhood was served, but it represented a huge leap forward in urban sanitation. Public latrines became an essential part of daily life, especially for people who couldn't afford private facilities. These communal restrooms were nothing like the private stalls we're used to today. Instead, you'd find a rectangular room lined with smooth stone benches, each punctuated by evenly spaced holes. Below, running water carried waste away, usually into the cloaca maxima or a similar drainage route. Despite the ick factor, public latrines were social hubs, where gossip often outranked the smell. People chatted, exchanged news, and treated the latrine as just another gathering place in the city. Of course, public latrines had their quirks. Toilet paper didn't exist. They used a shared vinegar-soaked sponge on a stick, rinsed for the next user. The lack of privacy, the communal sponges, and the ever-present odor remind us that even advanced sanitation had its limits. Still, these facilities offered a practical solution for the masses and helped keep the city's streets a bit cleaner. For the wealthiest Romans, life was more comfortable. Wealthier domus sometimes had 1 or 2 private latrine holes draining directly into the cloaca maxima. These private facilities, tucked away in the corners of grand homes, offered a degree of privacy and convenience that most citizens could only imagine. Access to a private latrine connected to the sewer was a mark of status, and it also meant less exposure to the public health risks faced by those using communal spaces. Most Romans, though, lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that rarely had any plumbing. Chamber pots were the norm. Residents collected their waste in these portable containers and emptied them when full. Ideally, they would carry the contents down to the street and dump them into public bins or drains. Legally, residents were to shout "cave" before emptying pots, though few bothered. In practice, many simply tipped their chamber pots out of windows or over balconies, sending waste directly onto the crowded streets below. Pedestrians learned to keep an eye out, but the result was often a mess, with refuse mixing into the dirt and adding to the city's already chaotic environment. Yet even in this challenging landscape, Romans found ways to turn waste into something useful. Urine, for example, was more than just a byproduct to be discarded. Thanks to its ammonia content, urine became essential in various industries, especially textile cleaning and leather tanning. Fullers, specialists in washing and processing wool garments, used urine to bleach and soften fabric. Public collection points sprang up across the city, allowing citizens to contribute their urine for industrial use. Rather than letting it go to waste, the Romans funneled this resource into channels. The economic value of urine collection grew so significant that by the late 1st century AD, Emperor Vespasian imposed a tax on it. The story goes that when his son Titus questioned the morality of taxing something as unsavory as urine, Vespasian waved a handful of coins from the tax under his son's nose and asked if the money smelled bad. When Titus replied that it didn't, Vespasian famously said, "Yet it comes from urine." This practical approach highlights the Roman attitude. Almost nothing was wasted, and everything had a use. Even substances most people would avoid. Despite these solutions, Rome's waste management system was far from perfect. The sewer network mainly served wealthier districts and public infrastructure, leaving most of the population to manage. In poorer neighborhoods, garbage and human waste often piled up before being cleared by hired collectors, a job done inconsistently at best. When waste couldn't be collected quickly enough, or when heavy rains and floods overwhelmed the system, the streets became hazardous. Contaminated water sometimes mixed with the Tiber River, which for some desperate residents was still a source of drinking water. This could spark outbreaks of disease. The risks went beyond disease. Piles of organic waste combined with narrow streets and open flames created a constant fire hazard. Trash left in corners or scattered through alleys could fuel fires, turning minor sanitation problems into city-wide disasters. Keeping waste out of public spaces wasn't just a health measure, it was also a way to reduce the risk of catastrophic fires. Rome's approach to waste management also revealed deep social divides. The wealthy could afford private latrines and regular access to water, while the poor relied on overcrowded public facilities and lived in conditions where waste often went unmanaged. In the insulae, overflowing chamber pots and shared sponges at public latrines were the norm. These inequalities shaped patterns of disease and discomfort, hitting the lower classes hardest while leaving wealthier neighborhoods comparatively healthier. Roman cities beyond the capital faced similar challenges. Ostia, Rome's bustling harbour, adapted its waste strategies to suit its location. Ports doubled as collection zones for trash and excrement, with some waste floated out into the sea. While this wouldn't meet today's environmental standards, it was a practical solution for a city with limited land and constant maritime traffic. Archaeological finds in port cities like Pisa show that elaborate waste systems sometimes backfired, with refuse clogging waterways or contaminating water supplies. These examples remind us that even the best engineered systems struggle to keep up with the demands of a vast, growing population. Still, Rome's ability to manage waste on such a large scale stands out as one of its most impressive achievements. The city's solutions were born out of necessity and shaped by the realities of urban life. The cloaca maxima, public latrines, and resourceful reuse of byproducts like urine all helped Rome function as a vibrant metropolis. The system had flaws, but it allowed the city to survive and thrive longer than most ancient capitals. It's important to remember, though, that every advance brought challenges. The cloaca maxima carried waste out of the city, but the Tiber River, where the sewage ended up, became increasingly polluted. Romans may not have understood all the health risks, but they saw the need to keep the city as clean as possible, given the tools and knowledge they had. Their efforts laid the groundwork for future urban sanitation, but they also revealed the limits of what was possible in their era. The story of Roman waste management is a story of ingenuity, adaptation, and struggle. Disease, overcrowding, and inequality were everyday realities. Yet, the systems the Romans built, however imperfect, formed the foundation for modern urban engineering and public health. Their successes and failures both serve as lessons for cities today. Managing human waste was messy, but at least it moved away. What happened when fire broke out and threatened to turn Rome into ash? Let's find out. Fires posed a constant danger in the crowded heart of ancient Rome. Life in an insula, a tall, narrow apartment building of wood and brick, meant you lived with the ever-present risk that a single spark could bring disaster. Kitchens were packed into cramped corners. Families cooked over open flames or smouldering braziers, and oil lamps glowed in every hallway. With thin walls, floors stacked one atop another, and neighbors living only a few feet away, even a small accident could ignite a catastrophe. The city's layout, narrow streets, tightly clustered buildings, and a lack of fire breaks only increased the threat. Fires could spread rapidly, leaping from one insula to the next, overwhelming residents before they had a chance to escape. The most infamous example was the Great Fire of 64 AD. It started in the wooden shops near the Circus Maximus and, fanned by summer winds, raged for 6 days. Many neighborhoods burned for days, displacing thousands. The flames destroyed much of the city's densely packed center where the poor lived in insulae. Eyewitness accounts describe panicked crowds fleeing through smoke-filled streets, with families separated and possessions abandoned to the blaze. The fire's devastation was immense, entire districts reduced to ash, countless people left homeless, and the city's landscape forever changed. Yet the Great Fire was not an isolated event. Regular outbreaks, sometimes small, sometimes catastrophic, reminded Romans that fire was an enemy never fully defeated. The insulae, which housed most of Rome's lower and middle classes, were especially vulnerable. These multi-story tenements, often 6 or 7 floors high, were built quickly and cheaply from wood, wattle, and brick. Overcrowding was the norm. Multiple families might share a single room, with little privacy and few safety measures. Cooking, heating, and lighting all relied on open flames. In such conditions, a dropped oil lamp or a cooking accident could set off an inferno. Without fire breaks or modern fireproofing, flames could travel up walls, across roofs, and through shared attics in minutes. Once a fire took hold in an insula, it was almost impossible to stop without outside help. Recognizing the city's vulnerability, Emperor Augustus took steps to address the problem. He reorganized the city's layout, widening some streets to slow the fire. More importantly, he introduced new building regulations aimed at reducing risk. Augustus outlawed the construction of excessively tall insulae, and set a building height of 70 Roman feet, about 65 modern feet. This made it harder for flames to climb and limited the collapse hazard during fires. He also encouraged the use of fire-resistant materials like stone and brick, though wood remained common for economic reasons. Open flames were regulated, with bans on certain types of stoves and restrictions on cooking fires in crowded areas. Augustus's reforms marked a shift toward prevention, not just reaction. But the most significant change came with the creation of Rome's first professional firefighting force. Under Augustus, the Vigiles were established as a dedicated brigade to patrol the city, spot fire hazards, and respond to emergencies. The Vigiles were organized into cohorts, each assigned to a different region of Rome. Their presence brought a new level of preparedness. They patrolled primarily at night, when most fires began, and kept watch for smoke, sparks, or the telltale glow of flames. The Vigiles used a range of tools to fight fires. Buckets were vital for forming human chains to pass water from fountains, wells, or aqueduct-fed cisterns to the site of a blaze. Fire hooks allowed them to pull down burning beams or walls, creating gaps to stop flames from spreading. Sand was another essential tool. Vigiles hauled it in sacks to smother embers or douse fires where water was scarce. In some cases, they even demolished buildings in the fire's path to create makeshift fire breaks, sacrificing property to save the neighborhood. One account describes Vigiles forming a human chain to haul sand into a burning attic, saving dozens of families trapped above the flames. Their quick action and teamwork often meant the difference between a contained fire and a disaster. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Vigiles faced suffocating smoke, collapsing structures, and the chaos of panicked crowds. Fires could break out at any hour, and the city's narrow streets sometimes blocked access to the worst blazes. Despite these challenges, their efforts saved countless lives. In neighborhoods packed with insulae, the Vigiles' rapid response was often the only thing that kept a minor kitchen fire from becoming a citywide emergency. Their presence gave residents a measure of reassurance, even as the risk of disaster never fully disappeared. Augustus's reforms extended beyond firefighting. He pushed for new standards in building design and city planning. Regulations required builders to use more stone and brick, especially for ground floors and supporting walls. Roofs, previously made of flammable wood and thatch, were increasingly covered with tiles or other less combustible materials. The city also imposed stricter rules on the storage of flammable goods, such as oil and grain, keeping them away from residential areas whenever possible. Enforcement was uneven. Corruption and cost-cutting sometimes led to shortcuts, but the new standards gradually improved safety. Open flames, a daily necessity for cooking and heating, were also regulated. Augustus's rules banned certain types of stoves and required that fires in public or crowded spaces be carefully monitored. In some districts, communal kitchens were built to reduce the number of individual fires burning at once. These measures didn't eliminate risk, but they slowed the rate at which fires broke out and gave the Vigiles a better chance to respond before disaster struck. Despite these advances, fires remained a frequent and frightening part of Roman life. The city's population kept growing, and demand for cheap housing meant that insulae continued to rise in every available space. Many landlords ignored building codes, adding illegal stories or using shoddy materials to maximize profits. In poorer neighborhoods, safety rules were rarely enforced, and residents lived with the knowledge that a single spark could cost them everything. Even critics like Seneca grumbled that baths and fountains outpaced ordinances in poor districts. The impact of fire was not felt equally across Roman society. The wealthy, who lived in single-family homes, domos, built from stone and set apart from their neighbors, faced less risk. Their houses were often surrounded by gardens or courtyards, providing natural fire breaks. They could afford private guards and access to better water supplies. In contrast, the poor, crammed into insulae, dependent on communal kitchens and lacking resources, were far more vulnerable. Fires that started in the slums could devastate entire districts, leaving thousands homeless, while wealthier areas escaped with little damage. These disasters reinforced the city's deep social divides. After the Great Fire of 64 AD, Rome underwent a period of rebuilding. Emperor Nero, who who was in power at the time, initiated an ambitious reconstruction plan. He widened streets, introduced green spaces to act as fire breaks, and insisted on greater use of fire-resistant materials. Some of these changes were unpopular, especially among property owners forced to give up land for wider roads, but they set new standards for urban design in the Roman world. The city's landscape shifted, streets became broader, buildings less crowded, and public spaces more common. Fire, while destructive, became a catalyst for change. The vigiles also evolved. Over time, they took on more responsibilities, including inspecting buildings for fire, enforcing safety regulations, and educating the public about prevention. They worked with local officials to identify risks, such as illegal construction or unsafe storage of combustibles. Their patrols became a familiar part of city life, and their readiness to intervene helped reassure anxious residents. In addition to fighting fires, the vigiles sometimes assisted with rescue efforts during building collapses or other disasters, further cementing their reputation as protectors of the city. The reality of fire shaped Roman life. Residents learned to move quickly when they heard shouts of fire, to grab what they could and flee down crowded stairways. Families kept their valuables close, knowing that evacuation might come at any hour. Children grew up hearing stories of great fires and the bravery of the vigiles. The city's architecture and routines reflected this awareness. Water jars were kept handy, exits were marked, and neighbors watched for smoke. The fear of fire was always present in the city. For all the anxiety, Rome's efforts to manage fire risks stand as an early example of urban resilience. The combination of the vigiles, new building regulations, and changes in city planning did not eliminate the threat, but they made Rome safer than it had been in centuries past. Fires still broke out, but the scale of disaster gradually lessened. Rome's leaders learned to adapt, using each crisis as an opportunity to improve the city's defenses. The struggle against fire also exposed the city's underlying inequalities. Poor residents bore the brunt of every disaster, often losing homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. Landlords sometimes neglected repairs, and city officials failed to enforce rules in the most vulnerable districts. Rebuilding efforts after major fires often benefited the wealthy first, with new infrastructure and safer buildings appearing in affluent neighborhoods, while the poor waited for relief. These patterns deepened the social divisions that marked Roman life. Still, the story of Rome's battle against fire is one of persistence and adaptation. The city's leaders responded to crisis with innovation, creating the vigiles, rewriting building codes, and rethinking urban design. Residents learned to live with risk, and the city endured. Fires shaped the way Rome looked, the way people lived, and the way the city understood itself. As the city grew and changed, new challenges always emerged. Fire was not the only threat to order in a crowded, unequal metropolis. With so many people from different backgrounds living side by side, the question of how to keep the peace became just as important as how to keep the city standing. The next challenge for Rome was not just physical safety, but social stability, finding ways to maintain order and prevent chaos in a city where wealth and poverty existed side by side. The challenge of keeping Rome's population in check went far beyond the city's physical safety. In a place where the elite retreated to their marble villas, complete with shaded courtyards and mosaic-tiled dining rooms, most citizens found themselves squeezed into insulae, towering, rickety apartment blocks where entire families might share a single, dark, cramped room. The city's layout itself reminded everyone of the social hierarchy. Wide avenues and grand temples stood in sharp contrast to the narrow, refuse-strewn alleys threading through neighborhoods of the poor. Inequality wasn't just visible, it shaped every aspect of daily life. At the top of Roman society were the patricians, the old aristocratic families whose wealth and ancestry gave them power in politics and society. They dined in lavish triclinium halls, discussing philosophy and statecraft, while their slaves worked silently in the background, preparing elaborate meals and tending to every need. Below the patricians were the plebeians, the working people who made up most of the city's population. Plebeians worked as craftsmen, merchants, laborers, or street vendors, relying on daily wages to survive. And beneath even the plebeians were the slaves, millions of people with no rights, whose forced labor powered much of the empire's economy. For the plebeians, the gulf between themselves and the patricians was daunting, but it was nothing compared to the chasm between free citizens and those who lived entirely at the mercy of others. This sharply divided society was always at risk of unrest. Economic downturns, food shortages, or political instability could quickly turn simmering discontent into open conflict. In a city as crowded as Rome, with its narrow lanes and teeming tenements, even a minor dispute could escalate into a riot. The memory of slave uprisings, like the one led by Spartacus, lingered as a warning of what could happen when the system failed to keep people under control. The Roman government responded with a calculated strategy: keep the peace by meeting basic needs and offering distraction. The most important tool in this effort was the grain dole, or anona. The state managed a vast system to import and distribute free or subsidized grain to eligible citizens. This wasn't generosity. It was a matter of survival for the city's poor and a way for the state to prevent hunger from turning into rebellion. The grain dole was essential. When shipments were delayed or harvests failed, food prices soared and the threat of riots became very real. Emperors personally oversaw the arrival of grain fleets, sometimes appearing at the docks to reassure the public that food was on its way. The anona was more than a welfare program, it was a pillar of social order. The satirist Juvenal quipped that citizens cared only for panem circenses, bread and circuses. He saw how the government's solution to unrest was to fill stomachs and keep the people entertained. But for ordinary Romans, the grain dole was a lifeline. Each day, crowds gathered at distribution points, clutching their tokens and waiting for their share. The system was tightly regulated, with eligibility lists and careful accounting to prevent fraud. For the majority who lived hand-to-mouth, the promise of daily bread kept desperation at bay, at least for a while. Yet food alone wouldn't keep the peace. The second half of the government's strategy was public entertainment on a grand scale. The circuses included a dizzying array of games, festivals, and spectacles designed to occupy the masses and distract from the hardships of daily life. The Colosseum, Rome's most iconic amphitheatre, stood at the centre of this system. Its stone arches and vast arena could hold more than 50,000 spectators, drawn from every corner of society. Admission was free thanks to imperial sponsorship, making the games accessible to all. Picture the anticipation as crowds filled the Colosseum, the hum of voices rising with excitement. When the games began, the atmosphere was electric. Gladiatorial contests were the main attraction, featuring trained fighters, some slaves, some volunteers, battling for survival and glory. A favorite gladiator could become a citywide sensation, with fans cheering every blow. Sometimes a skilled fighter would be spared at the last moment, and the collective gasp and roar of approval from the crowd was a surge of shared emotion, hope, relief, and awe mixing together. Picture a desperate crowd cheering as a favored gladiator survives a killing blow, hope and fear tangled in every shout. But the games went beyond simple combat. Exotic animal hunts brought lions, tigers, and bears from distant provinces, thrilling audiences with the spectacle of Roman dominance over nature. Sometimes the arena was transformed for mock naval battles, with ships clashing on water pumped in for the occasion. These displays were engineered for drama, reinforcing the emperor's power and Rome's reach. The games served a political purpose. By sponsoring extravagant spectacles, emperors and wealthy elites could win public favor and reinforce their legitimacy. The message was clear: Rome's rulers provided not only food, but also excitement, spectacle, and a sense of collective identity. The circenses extended beyond the Colosseum. Public festivals, religious holidays, and military triumphs filled the calendar. On these days, the city transformed. Streets were decorated with banners and flowers, vendors handed out free food, and actors performed in open-air theatres. Everyone was invited, from the poorest insular resident to the richest patrician. During these events, social barriers seemed to blur, if only for a moment, as the city celebrated together. Despite these efforts, the government knew that bread and circuses could only do so much. When crowds grew restless or violence threatened to erupt, Rome relied on force to maintain order. The city was protected by a layered system of enforcement. The vigiles were night watch and firefighters, patrolling after dark to keep the peace and respond to emergencies. The urban cohorts policed the city by day, dispersing illegal gatherings and quelling disturbances. The praetorians guarded the emperor and key political sites, serving as a final line of defense and a visible reminder of imperial authority. These forces worked together to deter unrest. The vigiles, in their distinctive uniforms, made regular rounds through the neighborhoods, watching for trouble and enforcing curfews. The urban cohorts, drawn from the ranks of experienced soldiers, could respond quickly to riots or protests. Their presence in the streets was both reassuring and intimidating. The Praetorian Guard, stationed near the heart of government, provided muscle for the emperor and sometimes intervened in political crises. Each group had a clear role, and together they formed a network of surveillance and control that kept the city's volatile population in check. When tensions flared, these forces acted swiftly. Food shortages, for example, could spark riots with little warning. There are accounts of angry crowds storming granaries or attacking officials when grain supplies ran low. In such moments, the urban cohorts and vigiles moved to restore order, sometimes using force to break up mobs. Their interventions were not always gentle, but they were effective in preventing chaos from spreading. The government's response to unrest combined appeasement with the threat of violence, a delicate balance that kept the city stable, if not content. The effectiveness of this system depended on constant vigilance. Emperors and city officials monitored the mood of the populace, anxious to prevent small problems from growing into crises. They used public announcements, ceremonies, and even personal appearances to reassure citizens and remind them of the government's role as provider and protector. The arrival of the grain fleet, the opening of a new festival, or the dedication of a public building became opportunities to reinforce the bond between ruler and ruled. Still, beneath the surface, the city's deep divisions remained. The spectacle of unity in the Colosseum or at a festival masked the reality that most Romans lived in poverty, while a small elite enjoyed unimaginable luxury. The grain dole and public games kept people fed and entertained, but they did not erase resentment or hardship. Juvenal's observation, panem et circenses, captured this trade-off. The people traded political engagement for comfort and distraction, and the government was happy to oblige as long as it maintained control. The emotional power of these spectacles cannot be overstated. For many, the games and festivals were the highlight of the year, moments when the struggles of daily life faded into the background. The roar of the crowd, the drama of gladiatorial combat, and the thrill of seeing exotic animals or grand processions offered a sense of wonder and belonging. These experiences provided not just entertainment, but also a shared narrative, a feeling that, despite inequality, everyone was part of something larger. Yet the peace Rome achieved was always precarious. The city's systems, bread, circuses, and enforcement, could keep the capital calm, but they did not address the root causes of discontent. The poorest still struggled to survive, and the divides between classes remained sharp. The government's hold on the city depended on its ability to deliver on its promises and to respond forcefully when those promises faltered. In the end, Rome's approach to social order was a mix of practical solutions and calculated spectacle. The grain dole kept hunger at bay. The Colosseum and festivals gave people something to look forward to. The urban cohorts, vigiles, and praetorians stood ready to intervene when needed. This combination allowed the empire to manage a city of extraordinary size and complexity, but it came at the cost of genuine social progress. Rome's systems kept the capital calm, but thousands of miles away, life looked very different. Off we go to the provinces. Stepping away from Rome's crowded streets and into the provinces, meant entering a world defined by open fields, small towns, and a slower pace of life. For most people in the empire, this was their everyday reality. The provinces, stretching from the misty hills of Britannia to the sun-baked valleys of Egypt, formed the foundation that supported Rome's power, even as their daily rhythms felt far removed from the capital's constant bustle. Living outside Rome brought its own set of challenges and routines. Provincial towns often lacked the sophisticated infrastructure that Romans took for granted. While aqueducts and grand bathhouses dotted the capital, many provincial communities relied on wells or local streams for water, and public amenities were scarce. Roads connected these settlements to the rest of the empire, but travel was slow, and news from Rome arrived only when traders or officials passed through. In a small village in Britannia, for example, families might spend their days tending sheep and working damp, rocky fields, far from the marble monuments and lively forums of Rome. Imported luxuries, like fine glassware or exotic spices, were rare, sometimes taking months to reach these distant corners, if they arrived at all. Despite these differences, the provinces were anything but uniform. Each region had its own character, shaped by geography, history, and the degree of Roman influence. In Egypt, life continued to revolve around the Nile's seasonal floods, which made the land fertile and allowed farmers to grow wheat for shipment across the empire. The landscape was dotted with temples to both Roman and ancient Egyptian gods, showing how new customs layered over deep-rooted traditions. In Asia Minor, cities like Ephesus and Pergamum blended Greek and Roman cultures. Roman baths and amphitheatres appeared alongside Greek theatres and local shrines, creating a cityscape where old and new coexisted. Meanwhile, in Britannia, rural life was shaped by a harsher climate and rugged terrain. Villages were scattered and farming was hard work, with communities relying on local resources and simple architecture. Romanization, the process of blending Roman customs with local ways, played out differently in every province. In some places, such as Gaul, Roman influence took hold quickly. Roman roads, amphitheatres, and temples appeared in town centres, and local elites adopted Latin for business and government. Villas sprang up in the countryside, serving as both rural estates and production centres for olive oil, wine, and wheat. Some provincial villas even had small on-site presses for oil and mills for grain, turning them into hubs of agricultural activity. These estates were not just symbols of wealth, they were the engines of the local economy, providing work for free labourers and enslaved people alike. But Romanization was never a one-way street. In Asia Minor, for example, Roman customs slipped in alongside strong Greek traditions. Public baths and temples dedicated to Roman gods became part of daily life. But they didn't erase the region's Greek heritage. Instead, marketplaces filled with Roman-style amphorae stood next to stalls selling goods from older, local traditions. Festivals continued to honor local deities, even as Roman holidays were added to the calendar. This kind of cultural blending created a patchwork society, Roman in law and language, but still deeply rooted in local identity. Infrastructure brought by the Romans transformed provincial life in other ways. The empire's roads, built with layers of stone and careful engineering, stretched across forests, mountains, and deserts. These roads connected even remote towns to the heart of the empire, making it possible for goods, people, and ideas to travel farther and faster than ever before. The Via Appia linked Rome to the south, while roads in Gaul cut through thick forests and in North Africa crossed wide plains. Traders moved olive oil, wine, and ceramics along these routes, and soldiers marched to enforce order and protect the empire's borders. The roads didn't just carry goods, they tied the provinces together, making each region part of a larger whole. Trade was the lifeblood of provincial economies. Coastal towns and inland ports served as gateways for goods moving between the provinces and the capital. Olive oil and fish sauce from Spain, grain from Sicily and North Africa, and wine from Gaul all made their way to Rome's markets. The discovery of a Roman port in Pisa, found buried under layers of mud, offers a rare window into these connections. Archaeologists uncovered objects like a sailor's brush, tiny proof of everyday life among provincial traders. Such finds remind us that behind the movement of goods were real people working hard to keep the empire supplied. Daily life in the provinces often centered on small towns and rural estates. Villas were more than just grand homes for the wealthy. They functioned as agricultural hubs with fields, olive groves, and vineyards spreading out around them. Granaries and presses for oil or wine were common features, allowing estates to produce, store, and sometimes export their goods. Local markets bustled with activity as farmers and craftsmen brought their products to sell or trade. For most people, life was shaped by the rhythms of the land, planting, harvest, and the changing seasons. Enslaved labor was a constant presence in provincial life, just as it was in Rome. The empire's expansion brought thousands of prisoners of war from regions as diverse as Greece, North Africa, Gaul, and Asia Minor. These men and women worked as artisans, craftsmen, and, most often, agricultural laborers on large estates. Their work underpinned the provincial economy, but their lives were often marked by hardship. The provinces were not just passive suppliers to Rome, they also shaped the empire in return. Local customs, foods, and even languages influenced Roman culture. The capital developed a taste for provincial products from Egyptian wheat to Spanish olive oil and North African garum, fish sauce. Some regions, like Egypt, became so critical to Rome's food supply that their harvests were essentially managed by imperial officials. This relationship was a two-way exchange. Provinces sent resources to Rome, and Roman customs, laws, and technologies spread outward in return. Despite the distance from the capital, provincial towns shared many features with Rome. Roman law provided a common framework for governance, adapted as needed to fit local traditions. Coins stamped with the emperor's image circulated in markets from Britannia to Egypt, creating a unified economy. Public buildings, baths, forums, amphitheatres appeared across the empire, giving even distant towns a sense of connection to Rome's grandeur. Gladiatorial games and festivals brought communities together, echoing the entertainment of the capital on a smaller scale. Yet for many provincials, Rome remained a distant presence, an idea more than a reality. The emperor's decisions shaped their lives, but most would never see the capital's marble streets or towering monuments. Their daily existence was grounded in the land, in local traditions, and in the slow but steady rhythms of rural and small-town life. Even as Roman influence spread, local identity persisted. People continued to honor old gods, speak native languages at home, and celebrate local festivals alongside Roman holidays. The discovery of sites like the Pisa port reveals just how interconnected the provinces were. The mud-preserved remains of a sailor's kit, including a brush, offer a glimpse into the lives of those who moved goods and news across the empire. These small details, tools, personal belongings, scraps of writing, bring provincial history to life, reminding us that the empire was built on the work and experiences of countless ordinary people. Villas, roads, and small towns were the backbone of provincial economies. Villas operated as both homes and production centres, with some featuring olive presses, wine vats, and granaries to supply local and distant markets. The road network allowed for the movement of goods and people, while towns served as centres for commerce, administration, and social life. The presence and quality of these features varied by province. Some regions developed extensive infrastructure, while others remained more isolated and rural. The tribute system was central to the relationship between Rome and its provinces. provinces sent food, raw materials and taxes to the capital, keeping Rome's population and military supplied. Amphorae of oil, wine and fish sauce bore the seals of tax officials, and every shipment was carefully recorded to prevent theft or loss. This system was essential for maintaining the empire's power, and the efficient collection and distribution of resources helped Rome thrive. Yet the flow of tribute also highlighted the dependence of the capital on its far-flung territories. Provincial life was shaped by both hardship and opportunity. The land offered stability for those who could work it, but drought, poor harvests, or heavy taxation could bring hardship. Local economies depended on agriculture and trade, but also on the labor of enslaved people, whose lives were often defined by toil and uncertainty. Communities were close-knit, relying on shared traditions and mutual support to get by. At the same time, the gradual spread of Roman law, language, and architecture created new opportunities for mobility and connection. The diversity of the provinces was one of the empire's greatest strengths. Each region brought something unique to the table: Egypt's wheat, Spain's oil, Gaul's wine, Asia Minor's crafts. This diversity enriched Roman society and helped sustain the empire through good times and bad. The provinces fed, clothed, and supplied the capital, yet each region retained its unique identity under Rome's rule. Understanding life in the provinces reveals the complexity and resilience of the Roman world. The empire was not just a collection of conquered lands, but a network of communities, economies, and cultures bound together by roads, laws, and shared experiences. The daily lives of provincials, whether farming in the Nile Delta, trading in a Gallic market, or working in a Spanish villa, were the foundation on which Rome's greatness rested. As we look back on the ways Romans solved the challenges of their vast and varied world, it's worth considering what their experiences can teach us. The ingenuity, adaptability, and cooperation that held the empire together offer lessons that still resonate today. Looking at Rome's daily life, 3 solutions stand out. The grain system that kept the city fed, the aqueducts that delivered water, and the sanitation networks that helped manage waste. Rome was among the first vast cities to integrate long-distance supply chains with public welfare programs, facing challenges like food shortages, water access, and overcrowding that still echo in cities today. Can modern cities learn from Rome's blend of engineering, logistics, and social programs? If you found Rome's ancient solutions fascinating, let us know in the comments which innovations surprised you most. Thanks for joining us as we explored how Romans met the demands of urban life.